Lowe's knows how to help you get the most out of your store run. That's why members save more with My Lowe's Rewards. Earn points towards My Lowe's money on eligible purchases. Get access to member-only deals and free member gifts. Plus, unlock free standard shipping when you reach Silver Key status. So what are you waiting for? Join for free today. Lowe's. We help. You save. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
This is Fortune's Wheel, a podcast history of the late Middle Ages, and I'm Jonathan. In an effort to keep this show going and one day be supported without ads, I'd like to invite everyone listening to become a supporting listener on Patreon. For as low as just $1 a month, you can enjoy listening to various standalone series, such as the 7-part series on Poland's 11th century, as well as complementary series that seek to fill in the gaps with information that didn't quite make it into the public show, such as the series called Context of a Conquest, in which we learn about various goings-on happening in the background of William the Conqueror's conquest of England. We're currently enjoying a series called The Book of Alexios that has already shown the rise of Alexios Komnenos and will be updated with the bits of his story that don't affect the main storyline of our public show directly. If you support what's happening here and want to hear more, please head over to Patreon and become a supporting listener. The link is in the show notes of this episode. I also want to give a very heartfelt and sincere thank you to our newest Patreon supporter, Penny Dunn. Can't tell you how much I appreciate you. Now, this episode is broken up into 2 narratives. These 2 narratives intertwine, but not completely. They do affect each other, but just not directly. The thing that ties these 2 storylines together, really, is the times that they occur. The spring, summer, and fall of 1081 weren't just pivotal months on the eastern coast of the Adriatic Sea. Matilda and Gregory VII were also battling their own battles on the west side as well. On this episode, we see the Adriatic surrounded by nothing but conflict. Germany invades Tuscany and Rome, the Venetians are already down with their navy near Durazzo, and the Byzantine Emperor rapidly approaches Guiscard's siege. This is episode 136, entitled The Adriatic at War. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. In August of 1081, just as Robert Guiscard began to realize the weight of his situation outside the walls of Durazzo, up in Germany, another storm was brewing. This storm, of course, revolved around the excommunicated King Henry IV and his arch-nemesis, the man who excommunicated him a couple times actually already, Pope Gregory VII. Since Gregory's papacy began in 1073, just 8 years before, this had been the focal point of everything happening in central Italy and north across the Alps. This resulted in German barons deposing their king with the Pope's blessing and encouragement a few times, as well as brutal battles fought to either install a new king or keep the current one in place. Germany was a battleground in the 1070s and 1080s, and I repeat, it all centered around the tensions between King Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII. Lest we forget, this has been going on for quite a while now, long before Hildebrand became pope. Remember, Pope Gregory VII was the first pope in history to depose a European monarch, setting a precedent that would echo through the centuries. Along with his 27 dictates, Gregory changed the political and spiritual landscapes forever, which is why he's considered an actual revolutionary man. Pope Gregory VII's papacy was a pivot point in Western history, make no mistake about that. For the last year, since 1080, Henry IV had done a pretty effective cleanup job with regards to the Great Saxon Revolt led by Rudolf of Swabia, who died that year from a horrific injury suffered at the battle on the Elster. There was an immediate fallout from Rudolph's death besides Henry's consolidation of power north of the Alps. For instance, with the powerful Rudolph of Swabia dead, barons and bishops south of the Alps also revolted and joined Henry's side. Matilda of Canossa immediately lost her possession of Lucca, and the bishops of Verona, Piacenza, Parma, Modena, Reggio, and Pistoia all recognized Henry's choice of pope, that is, Pope Clement III, as the rightful occupant of the bishopric of Rome. This, of course, left Pope Gregory VII once again without a chunk of support. He had by his side, for the previous 3 or so years, his dearest Countess Matilda, but in March 1081, just before Guiscard kicked off across the Adriatic, she had returned to her castle in Canossa. Michelle Spike, in her book Tuscan Countess, wrote the following, quote, Matilda left Rome when news arrived at the end of March 1081 that Henry had crossed the Alps. I wish I knew what was said on the day she went away. How did he bid farewell to the woman whose passionate temperament had inspired and encouraged him? How did she leave the man who had forever conditioned her awareness of the world? Did she store her winter robes in the tower on the Tiber, expecting Henry's stay in Italy to be brief? Or did they know they would never see each other again? End quote. That's right. The relationship that rocked the 11th century world, and I mean rocked the world, a pope and a noblewoman, scandalous in its mere existence, especially given the age difference between the two. Well, it was officially, unbeknownst to every single person alive at the time, it was officially at a close. Matilda would never lay eyes on her beloved Hildebrand. Hildebrand would never enjoy the sharp intellect and striking beauty of Matilda ever again. Now that said, Pope Gregory VII was forced to encourage another anti-king, just like Rudolph of Swabia, to claim the crown of Germany, thus undermining Henry IV's efforts in northern Italy, undermining Henry IV's efforts as he neared his beloved countess. This time, it was a man named Duke Gelf of Bavaria who answered the Pope's call. But it seems Matilda was well guarded in her mountaintop fortress of Canossa. The terrain itself was key. We've discussed this on past episodes. But the structure itself required very few warriors to guard it. She could keep safe in Canossa for years and live quite comfortably doing it. The stores in Canossa's towers and storerooms afforded her and those seeing to her every need years of relative comfort, as well as to their own. But the thing about locking yourself away from the fighting was that you kept yourself away from the fighting, away from where the decisions were made and the actions were taking place. Yes, Matilda was safe, but she was isolated beyond belief. In the valleys below her, just beyond the horizons, her Tuscan people lay in Henry IV's path. With their countess out of the picture, the barons of her lands simply stepped aside and got out of Henry's way as he marched almost unmolested straight toward Rome. Matilda was powerless to do anything against Henry except write her beloved pope and tell him of the rumors of Henry IV's movements. It seems that Henry had strafed her position at Canossa and made his way to Ravenna, where he picked up Archbishop Guiberto, who had just 11 months earlier been proclaimed Pope Clement III, or, as history remembers him, Anti-Pope Clement III. Gives you an idea how this whole episode played out. Now, Guiscard reached the shores of Corfu by June, but just a week or two earlier than that, in late May, Pope Gregory VII could only watch as Henry's army reached the walls of Rome, with a new pope in tow. By this time, Abbot Desiderius of Monte Cassino, the longtime intermediary between the papacy and the southern Normans, a man whose work just never seemed to end, a man widely renowned for his piety and generosity and even intelligent demeanor, well, Abbot Desiderius wrote to Gregory to update him on the Italian rumor mill. It seems that Countess Matilda had heard a rumor that King Henry IV had agreed to terms with Robert Guiscard that stated one of Henry's sons would marry one of Guiscard's daughters. This deal made by the German king was sweetened with the inclusion of the March of Fermo in northern Italy as a gift of the whole arrangement. Now, on the surface, this rumor was garbage. Guiscard had already turned Henry's overtures down before, having stated that he was loyal to the papacy and, not some far-off king. But when Guiscard up and left the peninsula altogether, his warrior wife and son Bohemond in tow, remember, Roger Borsa stayed behind to govern Apulia and Calabria while Dad was away. Well, the timing was odd to say the very least. It really did look like Guiscard was just, getting out of the way for Henry to come to Rome and do what he needed to do. Oops, I was away when it happened kind of idea. Gregory couldn't bring himself to believe the rumor. But in the meantime, the Pope had a city to defend, and he slammed the gates shut and refused the king entry. But the old Roman adage about quelling the passions of the layperson rang true once again. The Roman poet named Juvenal, in his work entitled Satires, written as far back as the 2nd century AD, he coined the phrase panem et circenses, which translates to bread and circuses. This was used as a critique against Romans and how easily it was to manipulate them. King Henry IV of Germany tapped into this cultural thread in the Roman mind because during the holiday of Pentecost, right outside of the walls of Rome, Henry put on a festival for the ages, like a real party. He set up games and food for all who attended. Droves of Romans left the safety of the walls and attended the religious party in peace and safety. And, while there, inside 2 conjoined tents, Anti-Pope Clement III gave his first official mass to the Roman people. This was all within sight, by the way, of Pope Gregory VII watching from the high tower of Castel di San Angelo. What's more, King Henry IV walked amongst the people wearing his father's imperial crown, a crown made of full iron, the very same crown Henry III wore when he was Holy Roman Emperor just a generation before. It was an absolute showstopper and a powerhouse move by the German king. It was nothing short of a gut punch to not only Gregory's papacy, but also to his and Matilda's revolutionary church reforms that came to be called, after him, the Gregorian reforms. For what reason would these same Romans out there enjoying free food and fun and mass with a king and anti-pope have in defending Gregory anyway at this point? While this was going on, Henry had been burning the midnight oil legitimately in his second objective while he was in Italy. As Spike writes, this objective was, quote-unquote, to reassert his royal rights over the towns in Bonifacio's former domains. Remember, Bonifacio was Countess Matilda's father, the man who built up the Duchy of Tuscany to what it was in Matilda's time. Matilda had fought for it to be hers by right for years, decades now, and Henry was hell-bent on destroying everything she cherished, from her claims to her father's land to her beloved Pope in Rome. Not only was Henry writing correspondences across Tuscany and Mantua and Lombardy up north, explicitly removing Matilda's rights to it all, but he was undermining her power base by kicking out bishops and abbots across the domains and replacing them with clergy who were loyal to his imperial ambitions and not to those pesky Gregorian reforms. One of the most famous of these usurpations happened to Bishop Anselmo of Lucca, who would be tossed in July of 1081. Spike writes, quote, these men fled to the sanctuary of Canossa. They arrived in pain with tales of disasters and catastrophes too horrible to name, of imprisonment and tortures, and even murders at altars as priests said mass, end quote. Donazone claims that Matilda denied not a single person who sought refuge with her, and the word got out that she was harboring these runaways. Donazone also writes that these bishops and monks and priests, quote, were scattered, darkened by the contagion of the heresy of Guiberto, that is Clement III, to the point that no place was immune from it. Only the vast home of the Countess Matilda remained pure. This truly was a secure place, a port for the believers. So many, in fact, did the king condemn, hunt, and disrobe, end quote. To boot, King Henry IV actually declared Matilda of Canossa an official enemy of the state, says Spike. This Bishop Anselmo of Lucca, given the situation at hand when Henry had both Gregory and Matilda pinned down, was proclaimed Matilda's standard bearer and advisor and confidant by Pope Gregory VII. According to Spike, Matilda would come to call Anselmo of Lucca, quote-unquote, her angel in hard times. But, unbeknownst to Henry, something else was kicked up in his fierce and largely successful campaign against Matilda and Gregory. See, all of these clergy who limped up to Canossa's famed walls and were welcomed with open arms by its matron, they all made up a pretty stout force of the most intellectual and spiritual elite of the day. These were both French and Italian scholars, really, mainly. Not just priests and monks. They were scholars. They all knew how to write. They all knew how to persuade. And they all knew how to tell stories. And with Anselmo of Lucca at the top of this hierarchy assembled, Matilda was able to wage a massively successful pamphlet war, as Spike called it. This pamphlet war, as I said, would become so much more than a public relations campaign against the German king. Spike writes, quote, "They wrote numerous treatises with complex theological arguments to justify Gregory's positions on the primacy of Peter, the infallibility of the church, and the legitimacy of the church fighting a war." Keep that one in mind. She goes on, "These Benedictine soldiers of God established a theology in favor of the church militant, which supported not just Gregory's war against Henry, but also the Crusades that would soon come." End quote. That's right. Those who know even a tiny sliver about the First Crusade will already know that it wasn't just a bunch of knights who traveled to Jerusalem to take it back from the Muslims. Hardly. It was actually a series of events that kicked the whole thing off. And this series of events was decades long, in fact. In many, many ways, this series of events had already begun on this podcast. But there is one major piece to the whole story of the First Crusade that gets absolutely no attention whatsoever, at least in my experience and very humble opinion. By Countess Matilda generously opening her doors at Canossa to any and every priest and monk affected by Henry IV's ecclesiastic usurpations across northern Italy, she actually created an army of scholars and theologians who created a philosophical and theological basis for Christian holy war. It's a bit more than that, and I can't wait to flesh it out for you all when the time comes on this show, involving Christian theology dating as far back as St. Augustine of Hippo's work. But without Matilda's actions, this simply would not have occurred. And you can't help but wonder if Pope Urban II's call to arms in 1095 would have fallen upon deaf ears without one Matilda of Canossa. Matilda would spend a number of years with these very same monks and priests at Canossa. These years would see her separated from not only her beloved Pope Gregory VII, but also the world. She was isolated, especially being the highest-ranking woman on the premises. But these men became her family, in a matter of speaking. Spike tells us that Matilda was always devoted to her Catholic faith, but she wasn't terribly pious when she arrived at the beginning of the period of isolation. But that would change. Spike writes, quote, "Matilda's years at Canossa transformed her," end quote. We learn that in any given 24-hour period, monks, as was the custom of St. Benedict's rules, prayed upwards of 7 times. Matilda rather quickly joined them in these prayers. This included matins, which is the midnight prayer service that monks wake up for each and every night of the year. Spike says, quote, "When in the course of these years Gregory died, the daily rhythm of prayer and meditation deepened the intimate passion of her youth into a widow's pious love," end quote. She could only settle in and wait on the outside world around her to shift, the tensions and the politics to ebb and flow, as she and her dear monks strengthened their arguments and their resolve in missive after missive discussed, written, and sent out to all corners of Christendom. Canossa was an isolated island in the middle of a turbulent world. There was no safer place for her to be, but there was also no prison quite like it. As for Gregory in Rome, he was left with no one himself. Rome was swayed by Henry's bread and circuses. His cardinals and priests, one by one, were also swayed, and he was detached from the one person he could count on the most in the world. And speaking of people he would expect to count on, Robert Guiscard was not returning his letters. Why? Well, at the time, already on the podcast, last couple episodes, we know why. He was a bit busy. See, Guiscard was entrenched outside the walls of Durazzo at the moment. Beyond that, Guiscard's forces had been ravaged by the sea in two ways, one natural, the other man-made. If you remember, Guiscard sailed his fleet north from Corfu and came across a horrible storm in which he lost men, boats, supplies, and horses. And then his navy had suffered further loss and embarrassment when the Venetians appeared on the horizons from seemingly out of nowhere. Then Guiscard received news from his west and his east. As if things couldn't possibly get any worse, from the east, word of Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, well, he was on his way to Durazzo. From the west, the German king was right outside Rome's walls, and the Pope's letters were increasingly panicked and filled with reminders of Guiscard's promise of loyalty and protection to the Pope. He could only hope that this siege there outside of Durazzo would do the trick, and do it pretty quickly. Now, as for Alexios Komnenos, he left around mid-August for his 2-month trip across the mountainous Balkans. He would follow as closely as possible the Via Egnatia, the same famous road that Guiscard is trying to take the beginning of in Durazzo. The fact that Alexios is taking this road just shows how much smoother it is to move a massive army across this particular region. He left his trusted older brother, Isaac Komnenos, back in Constantinople to deal with any possible usurpations that might take hold in his absence. Remember, Alexios Komnenos was in his first few months as emperor, and this was the 11th century in Constantinople. Any number of people could suddenly make a play at the throne. Isaac Komnenos would keep everything stable in Alexios' absence. And let's not forget about their mother, the indomitable Anna Delicini, in whom Alexios had formerly invested with any and all imperial privileges as he himself had. Constantinople was in the best of hands possible in August of 1081. Now that said, Alexios brought with him some pretty heavy hitters of his own. He knew these Normans well, having fought against them during his campaigns against the dreaded Norman Roussel de Bayeul. And speaking of Roussel, we cannot forget that Alexios used to bring Roussel meals while the Norman was starving in that Byzantine prison. They spent hours together, two of the most powerful warriors of their day. How could their conversations not have turned to topics such as Roussel's time in Sicily, fighting under Count Roger of Sicily? The Norman fighting machine, including their armor and weapons and tactics, and of course, the most powerful Norman in the south, Robert Guiscard. I refuse to believe these things didn't come up in their little chats. No, I truly believe Alexios prodded Roussel's mind for any information he may need in the future concerning the devastatingly effective Norman war machine. Who knew when the Normans would come knocking? They kind of had a reputation at this point. Along with his knowledge of Robert Guiscard and the Norman military machine, Alexios Komnenos also brought with him his new Grand Domesticos of the West, Gregorios Pekorianos. A second in command, however, was a new name for this podcast, Nicholas Branas, quote-unquote, a man of courage and considerable experience in war, as Anna Komneni describes him in the Alexiad. Now, Branas was surely an exceptional warrior in his own right in 1081, but the name, Branas, is one that will need quite a while to marinate. In fact, it will need about a century to marinate. But Nicholas Branas' work for Emperor Alexios I in the 1080s and 1090s, well, it will create a station for the Branas family that will not stray too far from the Komneni dynasty all the way through the end of the next century. But Nicholas Brannus' descendant, another successful warrior named Alexios Brannus, yes, you heard that right. Well, Alexios Brannus would one day become an indispensable piece to the Byzantine story. So, again, though, it will all begin with this particular Nicholas Brannus, the second in command of Alexios Komnenos' army, created to push the mighty Norman war machine back across the Adriatic, from whence it came. Now, there was also a legion of specialized warriors called the Excubitoi, which first appeared many centuries earlier under Emperor Leo I, but they had since become a kind of military police, according to John Carr in his book, The Komneni Dynasty. If you break down this Greek word, Excubitoi, you will see the prefix ex meaning out of and cube meaning room, but more specifically a bedroom here. So the Excubitoi were soldiers who were trained to, spring out of bed at a moment's notice, any time of the day or night or year. This specialized surprise force was highly dangerous and disciplined, trained to be unflappable, and it was led by a man named Constantine Oppos. This Constantine Oppos would be a man who first appeared in Anna Komnene's Alexiad during this 1081 campaign against Guiscard, but Oppos would rise through the ranks in the future and play important roles all the way through the First Crusade. Anna Komnene tells us of the rest of her father's military officers. Leading the Macedonian regiments was Antiochos. Leading the Thessalonians was Alexander Kabasilas. And the slave Tatikios, a trusted and cool-headed Muslim warrior, well, he led the Turk mercenaries, while Muslims Xanthus and Kuleon led the 1,000-strong Manichaean contingent. This army was diverse. We'll just leave it at that. Anna writes, quote, "All these men were excellent fighters, more than ready to draw blood of their enemies when the opportunity arose. They were headstrong and devoid of shame." End quote. As for Alexius's innermost bodyguard unit, called the Vestiarites, was actually a Frank named Hombutopoulos, who had more than earned Alexius's trust over the years, though we don't really hear about him until this point in her work. And finally, as for the famous Varangian Guard, well, it's 1081, and it's worth reminding ourselves that it had been exactly 15 years, almost to the month, that the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of King Harold II Godwinson fell to the dreaded Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror. During those 15 years, but really in those first 5 or so years, droves, and I mean droves, of Anglo-Saxon men left England forever. Many of their lands were already taken, their families slaughtered or died due to the conqueror's horrific famine-inducing treatment of Northumbria and into the Midlands, and their futures thrown to the wind. These men had no future at home. What was left for these young men but poverty, oppression, and most likely death in any number of ways? These Anglo-Saxons traveled far and wide, setting up new lives across Germany and France, Denmark, and Norway. But hundreds, and maybe even into the thousands of them, made it all the way to Constantinople, where they enlisted in the Varangian Guard, which had traditionally consisted of the fierce Rus Vikings, and even Swedish, like Harald Hardrada. At the time, a leader within the Varangian Guard was named Nambites, and his mere appearance and rank shows us that the Varangian Guard, over the last 15 years, had fundamentally changed from being almost exclusively Rus Viking to being mostly Anglo-Saxon. See, Nambites was rumored to have been the nickname, which was Germanic for corpse biter, by the way. Well, it seemed to be the nickname of an Anglo-Saxon named Wolf. Now, think about this for a moment. Imagine what those Anglo-Saxon Varangians must have thought when they were ordered to suit up and march to take on a fierce Norman army invading their new home. They had already had their worlds upturned when the last Norman invasion into their homeland occurred. How do you think they felt heading into this one? Revenge Well, it could not have been far from their minds. It was probably front and center, to be quite honest. Now, sometime between August and October, Alexios Komnenos came across a man who was coming from the region of Durazzo, and he provided the emperor with an update that I found quite interesting. After weeks of siege warfare, Georgios Palaiologos, remember he was the man Alexios sent to lead the defense of the city, well, Palaiologos had become weary of Guiscard's daily harassment until one day he led another sortie out to meet the Normans and their mercenaries. Anna Komneni writes what this man had told Alexios, and what she writes is a story that he said, focusing the he in the story is Georgios Palaiologos, to be clear. She writes, quote, "He had suffered serious wounds in different parts of the body. The worst was when an arrow penetrated near his temple. He tried to draw it out forcefully, but was unable to do it. An expert was summoned and he cut away the end, the butt where the feathers are attached, but the rest of it remained in the wound. Palaiologos bound up his head as best he could and hurried himself again into the midst of the foe, fighting on till late evening without flinching." End quote. At this point, we're told Alexios pressed the gas pedal pretty heavily, and the army double-timed it through the Balkans. When he reached the mighty city of Thessaloniki, he was informed of Guiscard's positioning around the city. It seemed the Normans took advantage of as many of the higher areas around the city, such as the hills and mountain passes, as well as guards and scouts throughout the forests and river valleys, waiting on any word or even sight of Alexios' army. It seemed he covered as much as he could spare, given the real focus was still on those siege engines. We're going to leave Alexios Komnenos as he's, huffing it along the Via Egnatia, and we're going to return to Durazzo itself. Naval warfare had occurred back in July, as we know, and the Normans learned a valuable lesson. This city won't be taken from the sea. The Venetians had seen to that one. The focus must be on defending his position and using those siege engines to their fullest extent. He had set a few wooden towers just outside of arrow reach for the remainder of the summer, but when the end of September and into October came, he decided he'd needled and prodded it enough. Those sorties were dangerous, but his men had easily enough thwarted them. It was time to move, though. In addition to his scattered men around the perimeters of the city, he'd also dispatched small bands of scouts to farther off regions in anticipation of the emperor's army. Word came back that they'd just passed Thessaloniki. The time had come to act. The emperor was on his way. Robert Guiscard ordered one of these towers to be pushed up to the wall. What he didn't realize was that his counterpart on the inside of those walls, Georgios Palaiologos, with part of an arrow still sticking out of his temple probably, well, he was just as intelligent as he was courageous.
This episode is brought to you by Hyundai. Think you know what an electric vehicle should be? Think again. From the charge time and range in the Ioniq 5 and 6 to the 601 horsepower Ioniq 5N, Hyundai is redefining what EVs should be. Learn more about Hyundai EVs at HyundaiUSA.com. EPA estimated 303-mile driving range for 2024 Ioniq 5 SE SEL limited rear-wheel drive and 361-mile driving range for 2024 Ioniq 6 SE long-range rear-wheel drive with fully charged battery. Actual range may vary.
Palaiologos had ordered his own tower to be constructed inside the walls opposite the Normans' tower. When they saw the Normans' tower being moved closer, Palaiologos ordered his to mirror it. All night, the night before, Palaiologos oversaw a simple plan using a long plank of wood. It was very heavy, and it needed to be tested before the time came when Normans would come pouring out of the tower and onto the top of the walls. He was very hands-on with the experiment, Palaiologos was, and after seeing it work, relaxed just a bit. The next day came, and Guiscard ordered the tower to be pushed toward the wall. Anna tells us that around 500 fully armored and fully armed knights piled into the tower, where they formed a line of deadly metal, each man an individual ring in the chain that Guiscard intended to invade the city with. The tower finally reached its intended position. Archers rained down arrows at the tower, hoping to find one of the many gaps in the wood plank walls. It's worth mentioning that the tops of these towers were open with only the front of it boarded up. Those arrows also served as a distraction because throughout the hundreds of thumps of arrowheads being driven into the wood facade, Palaiologos was ordering his men, the screaming and the sounds and everything, to push the plank out of his own tower opposite the Norman one and wedge that plank between itself and the Norman door that the enemy would come out of. More and more Normans pushed to the top of their own tower, hoping to push whatever was blocking the door from opening, but to no avail. The knights on the inside of Guiscard's tower were supposed to push the giant wooden door at the top of their own tower forward. Falling forward, that door would become a bridge upon which they would reach the walkway at the top of the wall. Anna writes the following, quote, "As Palaiologos' beam, that wood plank, made it absolutely impossible to open the door, Robert's stratagem was frustrated." End quote. With the plank stuck and handfuls of Normans exposed at the top of the tower, Palaiologos ordered his archers to rain down hell upon them, even more than previously. This caused an absolute panic in those knights to rush below decks. But several knights were lost, jamming the way down. That is, they were hit, struck, wounded, or killed, jamming the way down. At the same time, Palaiologos ordered the tower to be set on fire. Being wooden, it took seconds to be completely engulfed, with hundreds of knights desperate to escape down the large wooden tower. Those stuck at the top of the tower, Anna tells us, chose to throw themselves over the side. And if that wasn't enough, Palaiologos himself rushed down to the ground level where he had a sortie team ready. He threw open the gates while all this was happening and led a lightning raid on the tower itself, not only slaughtering the knights that were able to escape at the bottom, but also destroying the bottom of the tower with axes, rendering the entire structure unusable if the Normans were able to pull it back. This was an absolutely terrible blow to Guiscard, who could only watch from a safe distance as it all unfolded. He immediately ordered another such tower constructed in haste. Shortly thereafter, on October 15th, Georgios Palaiologos and Robert Guiscard both eyed a massive, massive army coming from the east. The emperor had arrived. Palaiologos, exhausted with a fresh wound to his temple, I honestly can't imagine what he must have felt in that moment. Georgios Palaiologos was without question the man of the hour. As far as I know, few defenders in history came close to the intelligence, ferocity, ingenuity, and courage displayed by Georgios Palaiologos between June and October of 1081. He was put in an impossible situation, but he made it all possible. Hats off to that guy. Now, Alexios settled his army along the river Karjanis. In Alexios' typical pattern, he immediately set to not only work on his military strategy, but also his communication game. This communication game was his specialty, and it seemed he kicked it off with a simple letter one might slide across someone's desk in English class while the teacher wasn't looking. Alexios sent Guiscard a letter simply asking why you even came to Durazzo. So many battles being waged in this part of the narrative on both sides of the Adriatic. Not all battles are fought on a battlefield, though. Matilda and Gregory waged a battle of influence. Henry IV responded, using his own influence as well. Guiscard waged a battle of conquest, while the Venetians waged a battle proving their loyalty to Eastern Rome. We shall see the nature of Alexios Komnenos' battle against the Normans in the next couple episodes. The pivotal city of Durazzo is front and center on the next episode, and I can't wait to tell you about it.